a senior researcher fellow at the trade collective, Lebohang Pheko. Ms. Pheko, thank you very much indeed for your time. Always a pleasure having you in studio. And look, it's been a busy news year, and obviously we can't get through all these top stories, but let's start off. Surely one of the big stories was the stepping down of the former President Jacob Zuma. Consequential event in South Africa?
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, I think it's been 10 years of a very strained attack and test of our institutions in this country, of democratic governance, of constitutionalism. And one of the things I think that has been a saving grace over the last 10 years, and particularly the last 18 to 24 months, has been strong institutions. There's been attacks on the public protector, attacks on the constitutional court, attacks on legal and legislative systems. And certainly the consequences of that mean that we have a weakened sense of public confidence, a weakened sense of what our governance actually means, and a weakened sense of a center of power.
Look, let's just delve a little bit more into the role that the former president is currently playing in the South African political landscape. We see him now joining social media on Twitter. What do you think his role is in politics in South Africa currently?
Yeah, it's odd. I mean, I think the one thing is he's clearly not going away quietly. It's entirely different to the departure of former President Mbeki, which was very quiet, quite ignominious, and almost shrouded in mystery and a sense of shame, even though he hadn't per se done anything wrong. And yet this is entirely different. I don't know if the times are different or if it's also an entirely different personality. And he also seems quite determined to play a significant and substantive and visible role leading up to the elections in 2019 on behalf of the ANC, and perhaps also on behalf of the KZN constituency. And I find his ongoing presence slightly uncomfortable and slightly problematic.
Why do you say that?
I think that for everything that he has been part of representing, a very poor governance structure, very compromised governance institutions, nepotism, cronyism, and so on. I'm finding it very difficult to understand why we would continue to give him as much oxygen and as much airtime as we are giving him, both in the party and also in the public, in public domain and in public spaces.
Well, then we see the so-called new dawn coming in. It's been a common refrain over the past couple of months. What does this new dawn really entail?
Yeah, I think that we're all trying to get our heads around it. So one of the things that President Ramaphosa had mentioned at Nasrec when he became the party president was this New Deal. And of course he was evoking the era that had come out of the depression in the US, and there's a kind of a 10-point plan, which I won't go into right now, but it certainly speaks to economic renewal, it speaks to job creation, it speaks to a new form of industrialization, and so on and so on, and expanding South Africa's footprint both economically and politically. And I think that what we have seen right now are a couple of attempts to bring it to light, a couple of summits, and so on and so forth, the investment summit, the job summit, and so on. And he seems to be about building consensus and bringing stakeholders around the table. How effective this has been so far remains to be seen, and certainly in terms of the actual fiscus, state fiscus, and economic turnaround, that has not yet been tangible. But look, these things may take time.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking about time, is it a proper time to judge him on this? I mean, rebuilding an economy is one of the biggest challenges. We see unemployment reaching about 27.5% in the third quarter of 2018. Youth unemployment remains a major issue. From what he's done so far, is there light at the end of the tunnel?
It depends on sentiment. So much of this is about fomenting a new sense of optimism and sentiment. And a lot of investors and investor climate responds to sentiment, and it responds to bold, strong actions. We haven't seen as much boldness, but I certainly think that he's tried very hard to cast himself as entirely different to the previous administration. Difficult because, of course, he was the deputy president at that time. So there's always that sense in which he too, in some respects, has been compromised, and he was there as deputy for 5 years, but now perhaps has more space and levity to be able to cast a different vision. I don't think that, from what I'm seeing on the ground, however, that it's particularly having the quick impact. There seems to be a sense in which many people wish that he were faster, more decisive, made stronger noises about the things that matter, and he's sometimes seemed to be slightly trying too hard to be all things to many people.
What about the minimum wage? An important step?
A very important step, but again, problematic because we haven't really resolved the issues of what is a decent wage to live in this country. We are still struggling to define what a decent wage is and what a decent job is. And in a country where we come from a history, which is still with us, of intergenerational poverty, of intergenerational and structural inequality, where people emerge from a particular social and race-based lack of opportunity, and as a result are hampered by the kind of choices and the life opportunities that they have open to them, it may actually be seen as entrenching the kinds of wages and the kind of jobs which are entitled, which a few people have been entitled to or have been able to access over the last, many decades. So it's a step, and I suppose it's something to work with. But certainly, again, one would hope that we can move at greater speed and be much more decisive about what a minimum wage and what a decent lifestyle for an African person in this country is.
Let's turn our attention to the Democratic Alliance. I mean, they squabbles with Patricia de Lille played out in the public domain. How do you think that party handled that issue?
Quite badly, I think. I think that there was a lack of strategic finesse in that regard. It seemed as though it was actually a series of internal squabbles and internal power bases playing themselves out in the public domain. And I think that you would see that there's a kind of an old traditional guard of what has been the traditional DA constituency, certainly at odds with and at war with the more urban African-based guard, which is emerging right now, with, exemplified, I suppose, by the current leader of the DA, by previous leadership such as Lindwe Mazibuko, and so on. And then I think that what this has also illustrated is that, again, the current leadership has to decide right now whether or not they are going to break rank with their traditional power base and decide to go for broke with aiming for an urban black and rural African constituency in terms of vote, because frankly a white vote is not enough to bring any party into power. Just the numbers alone are not enough.
Is there enough time to turn that around?
I don't think so. I mean, this is already, tomorrow is January. Elections are coming up in May. It would have to be a lot of very fast maneuvering in order for this to happen. There's been a 12 months of squandering and of really very bruising politics. I mean, the debacle with Trollope and so on, and the various breaking coalitions at many municipalities. I mean, Solim Simang barely survived a vote of no confidence, but it also illustrates that our politics are growing. I mean, I think both the DA and the EFF, however fractiously they may be doing so, are illustrating that to a great extent we have moved into the era of a new form of politics. It can't be all or nothing. It can't be go for broke. It has to be consensus, cooperation, and coalition politics. But certainly this year has been a huge test for this new model of doing politics.
Those squabbles with Patricia de Lille, you mentioned the Ethel Trollope issue. Do you think it's likely to hurt them in next year's poll?
I think it's quite certain. The kind of sentiment, and it's not so much about the squabbles, it's the handling of them, the optics around them, the speed and the way in which they are handled, the velocity of voice as well. How then have they, the relationships, the relationship management around them, and also what these different squabbles represent within the party and how they are perceived by voters. I think Patricia de Lille represents a very strong constituency in the Western Cape, the so-called colored constituency and so forth, but also a particular kind of politics as well. And I think that, again, they have not been very effective at managing and being unifying in this regard.
No doubt you'll agree that our National Assembly has been very, very lively. The EFF, often in the thick of things. But we saw in October, seemingly tables were turned where we heard shouts of pay back the money during the debate of the great heist, the VBS mutual bank scandal. They vehemently denied any involvement in this scandal. But what's your take? Has the scandal hurt them?
It doesn't seem to have hurt them as much. I've been talking to a few colleagues about this, and we have of different opinions. The one thing is that, of course, there's always going to be a digital footprint. So anybody who has the energy can go and trace some of the transactions, and we can have a truthful and completely objective narrative of what actually occurred. But I think that their problem is, of course, that they have postured themselves as being anti-corruption, as being somehow the ethical voice of leftist radical politics in this country. And I mean, there's no doubt that I've never thought that that could be entirely true, because certainly any machinery is bound to have its own foibles. And of course, historically, they've had their own issues. I think Mr. Malema's taxes and so on and so forth. So I mean, in matters of probity, historically, I think that they were foolhardy to posture. But the problem is, when you shout that loudly, we listen a lot more closely, and we want to see the evidence of this. Any time that there is any kind of violation of this probity, of course, we'll be looking and examining it more closely. I think that what they managed to do, though, was come out on the offensive very aggressively. And of course, they've got a formidable Twitter following and Twitter presence, which churns out literally hundreds of tweets per day and retweets hundreds of tweets per day, which are able to shut down quite a lot of dissenting voices and critique in this regard. So they created a lot of smoke around this. I
mean, their base seemingly is very loyal, but are they growing from your research?
It's not grown as exponentially as within the last 5 years, but I think that they're going to indeed maintain their voter turnout, their voter numbers in 2019. There might be marginal increase in a few areas, especially because remember that there's a whole generation of new voters as well, and the people who they appeal to are the young. So I mean, if you've got potentially 5, 6, 7, 8 million new voters, and you also have potentially many voters who perhaps of a particular age, particularly 35 and under, who've been disaffected, disinterested, who if they are sold out to the youthful vibrancy, certainly which EFF seems to represent and seems to appeal to, they may be convinced to vote differently. So I mean, that 10 million chunk of particularly young voters, I mean, these are including four lists, etc., people on campuses, people who have just left high school as well, who'll just be voting for the first time, like my own daughter who'll just be voting for the first time next year. So you've got a whole range of, you've got a potential in that regard.
So the social media strategy is extremely important, isn't it? Even if you look at the United States of America, Donald Trump uses it very effectively. Even Barack Obama uses it extremely effectively.
Mr. Trump.
Well, depending on which side you look at it, I mean, going forward into 2019, if you want to attract that youth vote, you need to get on this, isn't it?
Well, I think that's what a lot of parties are doing, and I think that's been well understood across the political spectrum. What I do think, though, is that what is unfortunate about social media and Twitter is that because it happens in real time, a lot of misinformation and disinformation also moves at a great speed and at great velocity. And what that does is it also moves away from the relational aspect of politics. I mean, I think that I can't remember the last time anybody knocked on the door to say, my name is Mang Mang and I am from party X and I would like your vote. That whole kissing babies type of politics seems to be diminishing, and I think it's a pity because they will never, in my opinion, and maybe again this is a generational thing, I don't think that we should use social media as a proxy or as a replacement for the real interaction on the ground, going to rallies, having branch meetings, meeting people in community halls, meeting people in public spaces, under trees, and etc., in churches, because that is actually much more personal, much more intimate, and that should not just be kind of cheap electioneering every 5 years. That's really something that political parties need to invest in all the time.
Are South Africans not ready to, like in America they call it the anti-establishment candidate? In South Africa, are we not looking at that? Are we still pretty much looking for the conservative, the traditional rather, politician?
Who is the traditional politician in South Africa? Remember, we have an entirely different context, of course, from the US. So you're not going to have, I mean, I don't see how a Donald Trump there was a bizarre apparition. But what we have here, of course, we're coming from a political history of a post-colonial post-independence, which is quite similar to other African countries. And of course, this whole struggle fervor. And what is happening, rather than perhaps traditional in relation to having impeccable struggle credentials, either an exiled or Robben Island CV, we're growing away from that. There's no doubt about it, and that's a generational thing, and it is inevitable. And we can see how it has atrophied in countries like Zimbabwe, where there's been a decisive generational departure, and which was symbolically, with the symbolic departure finally of President Mugabe, seems to have created at least the space for different possibilities. I think we're fortunate here that we actually have a lot more vibrancy, and that vibrancy has emerged far more quickly. We've had several breakaway parties from the ANC and from other I mean, the IFP has had its own breakaways. We have we had Ahang, COPE, EFF, there was ID, which was Patricia de Lille's previous incarnation. She came out of the PAC. So we've already actually been doing and developing far more, quite differently in some regards, and developing our democratic footprint slightly differently from our counterparts. But I think it's because of the timing in which we came into this dispensation.
What do you make about these new political parties? Does South Africans have appetite for more political parties? We saw Patricia de Lille's Good Party, Claudie Motsoneng launching a party. What's your thoughts?
Well, the fact that they seem to get some airspace seems to indicate then that somebody out there, it could be somebody's mother-in-law, their immediate family, but I mean, there seems to be some appetite for different ideas. I mean, I don't quite buy the idea, the notion that we should shut down. I mean, of course, there's some party. I mean, if it's like 5 people and they're, the cat and the dog, that's a whole different thing. But I think that the idea of shutting down the possibility of multiple voices and multiple narratives and multiple choices is quite problematic, because it suggests that we should only have a de facto 1 or 2 or 3 party system, which may not really speak to all of our political sentiments. Remember that the ANC, they won with 65% of the vote. Remember that hardly barely 50% of the population, the voting population, actually participated. So it amounts to quite a small mandate, and this means that there's space for there's clearly spaces for other ideas, and we need to ask, well, the other people decided to go to Sterkynoko, do their laundry, go to the mall, have a braai, instead of going to the polling station. What is it that needs to happen? What are the kind of ideas that need to occur and that need to be created to convince them to go to the polling station, rather than having braais and stuff like that? What will galvanize them to be much more engaged citizens?
Let's look at state capture. It had millions of South Africans glued to their screens, and part of the work of state capture was to figure out whether the environments that existed may or may not have provided fertile ground for state capture. From what you've seen, from the testimonies that you've heard, what sort of picture is being painted? Well,
the one thing, so the state capture issue becomes a bit complicated. I mean, I think that we need to ask ourselves what has been captured and when did this actually begin. I find it difficult to believe that it begins and resides and ends at Saxon Road with with this particular family, and I think that we would be fairly scandalized or horrified if we were to dig a bit deeper and further beyond this small family and beyond those transactions. What it has done, though, and this whole year of the year of the commission, we might as well call it, has been to at least give us a semblance that there's consequence management in this country, which there hasn't really been much of for the last previous 10 years per se, and a sense in which there's also an attempt to redeem state institutions and redeem people's confidence in these institutions, and also in a sense in which, of course, we are hopefully going to see some kind of era of prosecutions, trying to redeem and to repatriate these stolen funds and these ill-gotten funds. You and I probably both know that at best it will be symbolic, and that we'll never see the true extent of it, and that what has been captured to a great extent may never actually be redeemed. I'm slightly cynical about it, but I am hopeful and slightly sanguine in the sense in which it gives South Africa restores some kind of moral high ground and a sense of an ethical center, which has been sadly lacking.
Well, speaking about confidence in institutions, the NPA is one of them, and we have a new National Director of Public Prosecutions, Shamila Batoy, who's likely to start her tenure in February. She's going to be very much involved in this.
Yes, she is.
Big job.
Huge job. I mean, the NPA being one of the institutions which has been taken a bit of a credibility battering over the last, couple of years in particular, and has also been seen to be at odds with the findings of the Constitutional Court at some stage, refusing to pursue charges against the former president and Mr. Sean Abrahams as well, having been seen by some to be part of the instrumentalization of capture, whatever that may or may not mean to us. So what we hope that this means is that, of course, the current public prosecutor is going to be able to, again, bring us, somebody who doesn't seem to have been embroiled in party political quagmire, who doesn't seem to be tainted by any particular factionalism, and who's really built a solid reputation as a really fantastic jurisdiction over the last 15, 20 years.
Land, very emotive issues, one of the most emotive issues in South Africa. We had the land hearings, we've heard what came out of that. Do you get, though, that the issue of land, to an extent, is polarizing South Africa and seen along racial lines?
It's doing what it needs to do, is my opinion. I think the land question was one of the neglected issues in 1994, even as part of the negotiated settlement. It was it was inevitable that it was going to rear its head, particularly because we live in a country which is of course still racially polarized. It is polarized because of the access to resources, access to opportunity, as I mentioned before, access to economic access, which is racialized. And there's no getting away from the fact that many people, many families, many communities are living still the legacy of landlessness and the powerlessness of that and of dispossession. It is still fairly shocking, fairly disgraceful that you go to one community which is seen as a black area, an African area, an African township, or an informal settlement, and you can see the demographics are visible by the size of the house, the size of the garden, or the lack thereof, and so on and so forth. And this is not something that is really sustainable. And if we're going to talk about land, we should also be speaking about land in the context of land economics, and that land is not just about it's not just a party political slogan, but it's actually about really the restitution of a historical, colonial wrongdoing and injustice. The modalities remain to be seen, but I think that it's very important that it has been placed on the table and that it's a debate that many people are having. For whatever reason, some of it might be for vote grabbing, some of it might be just for populism, and so on. But it remains a very important debate, and I'll be interested to see whether we can manage it in a way that's productive, constructive, and that ensures that redistribution does take place appropriately to the communities who have a legitimate claim over land, the individuals, the communities, families, and so on. Well,
there's been very vocal opposition to land expropriation without compensation, but do you reckon it's a done deal?
Nothing's a done deal, but I certainly think the language using is wrong, because when we talk about expropriation, it's as though that's been my concern with the way that we've been framing it. Expropriation suggests that you are taking something that belongs to somebody else, and remember that land was grabbed illegally. People were dispossessed. So the point of departure needs to change. The framing of the conversation, I think we need to nuance and be very specific about what we're talking about.
In terms of the positives for 2018, what stood out for you?
I think, there have been many, actually. I think that the new kind of sense of energy, the stepping down of the former president would have been one, because it has opened up these very difficult and complex processes of trying to deal with and manage the consequences of the previous 10 years. It has, so many things have come out from under the carpet. Certainly the opportunity to redeem particular institutions. And I think the other thing is also the opportunity to redeem some of the economics in this country. So interest rates, what are we going to do about that? Inflation, what are we going to do about that? What are we going to do with some of our state-owned enterprises? And how are we also going to galvanize and ensure that we have a country that's working again, that's that's getting educated as well, that's skilled appropriately to meet the economic needs and demands in order to get far more of the growth that we need. But at least it seems to open up some kind of possibilities, and I think all this is exciting.
One of the big topical issues was the petrol hikes in South Africa. We understand that it's going to be a drop soon, but what sort of, I mean, that really raised the temperature here in South Africa, isn't it?
In every way, you know, in every way. So, I mean, it raises the temperature because of course, it means that local producers and local manufacturers pass the cost of their products to consumers, to you and to me. So, you know, Pick and Pay have to, you know, they have to figure out then if it's going to cost them more to transport their bread, their milk, and so on and so forth. But also for smaller, for producers, it means that they are going to, who are competing with companies which are often hugely subsidized, international companies, and also companies which produce in huge bulk, especially steel, metals, and so on. It has really been extremely difficult for them to be in any way competitive and in any way able to stay afloat. And we need to think a lot more. I think the state has to think much more carefully around subsidies and protective measures for small scale, for smaller industries, because that's also, by the way, the industry which employs the greatest amount of people in this country.
So do you see going into 2019 the economy being one of the focal points and one of the main challenges?
It has to be. There's no other way. So we're looking at a few scenarios. The one scenario is that commodities prices might actually stabilize, which would be better for us. It would also be better for the rand. That's the other thing. The other thing is that, of course, we're hoping that the rand is going to stabilize. I don't think that the rand should free fall. I don't believe in weak local currency, because it means that the cost of imports is increased, and for as long as we've got this large capital account deficit, which means we import more than we export, we can't afford to have a weak currency. It also means that it's much more difficult for our local suppliers to import the things that they need. We hopefully are going to see interest rates calming down a bit, because this has implications, of course, on domestic users. I mean, homeowners, car owners, all of these things have an impact. But also for smaller businesses, again, local businesses which need to borrow in order to expand, or in order to develop a shortfall, to have a shortfall in their own company day-to-day operations. That makes getting a loan a lot easier for them. So I'm hoping that we're going to have a much more energized economic outlook, and also lastly an economic outlook that is much more outward looking in relation to the rest of the continent. So we've been very much look east, look north, but there's a massive, I've said this all the time, there is so much potential for us if we choose to do more trade with countries which are interested in trading with us. Kenya, Ghana, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and so on, where there's massive growth, far more growth than in a lot of the northern countries, which we seem quite determined to hold on to as our primary trading partners.
So look to the continent,
Look here,
There's so much that we can discuss, we need to discuss, but I think we touched on a few of them. Lebohang, thank you very much indeed for your time. Appreciate your insight. Lebohang Pheko is a Senior Research Fellow at Trade Collective. Always appreciate her insight. Let's take a quick break.